Howdy, it's Kyle talking about New England. I recently returned from a 17-day road trip in the region, and in this video I want to discuss some of the things that I've seen. And this was a really exciting road trip for me because I've traveled extensively throughout the rest of the contiguous US before visiting New England even one time, so I was just super pumped about visiting this area. So let's talk about New England. Starting with some of the basics, New England is the name of the northeasternmost portion of the US, and it consists of 6 states. The population of the region is about 15 million people, and Massachusetts alone accounts for about 40% of the overall New England population, and the Boston metropolitan area, which extends into southeastern New Hampshire, also is about 40% of the overall New England population. Before I get started talking about the individual states, I want to point out that I'm not going to be mentioning Maine very much in this video, being that of the 17 days on the road trip, 8 of them were spent in Maine, so I'll have a specific video just on Maine. But now let's get into the other states. I entered New England at Greenwich, Connecticut, which is the southwesternmost point of the region, and it's part of the New York City metropolitan area. It's well known for being one of the wealthiest suburbs in the country. It's a very powerful zip code. Some of the most rich and powerful people in the world live here. But it isn't all just giant mansions. There's a nice historic downtown with some cool little shops. And not all of the city is super rich. Part of it is, dare I say, shabby. It's probably shabby chic being Greenwich, but it isn't all just super ultra wealthy, but a lot of super ultra wealthy people do live there. The next city that I stopped in was Stamford, which is right along the coast. I wasn't quite sure what to expect from Stamford. I didn't know a whole lot about the city, but it does have a nice historic downtown. I walked around for a while. That's great for walking. Ate lunch at a nice local cafe. So just overall good impressions for the first part. After leaving Stamford, I headed up the coast a little bit more. The next place I stopped at was New Haven. I found the city to be very interesting. It's very dichotomous. It's home to Yale University, which is an Ivy League school. So it has a little bit of an Ivy League air to it. However, there's also kind of a seedy side to New Haven too, and you would really see the both sides of this in the main area right in the heart of downtown that's called the Green. There would be college kids sitting there having a picnic lunch. There would be yuppie families having a takeout cafe lunch at a picnic bench, and a lot of homeless folks there. I literally saw some dude selling drugs from a street corner. Cars would pull up and he'd throw whatever's going into the car in there and the guy would pay him. So a lot of different things going on right there on the Green in New Haven. Next stop was the city of Hartford, which is the state capital. It's home to what I believe is the most beautiful state capitol building in the country. Really cool to see in person. The downtown had some really nice old architecture, some nice history to it, and it was okay for walking around, but the overall city just didn't quite seem right. The struggles of Hartford are very well documented. It has really high poverty, really high crime, and things seem to be getting a little bit worse actually. I didn't really see any indication of any kind of new economic development going on, no new buildings, no new businesses coming to town, nothing major to really help out the city. So just like the rest of the state, it does continue to lose population. So that was basically it for my time in Connecticut. And if you're from there, you might be thinking, man, he missed all the best spots. But just know that I do know enough about the state to where I wouldn't base my entire opinion on the state by just what I saw. I know there are some nice parts of the northwestern portion of the state where it's more wooded and rural, and some nice beaches in the southeastern portion of the state, but I didn't get to see either one of those. The next state that I visited was Rhode Island, which is the smallest state in the country in terms of area, and the population is just over 1 million. Interesting to note that about 10 years ago, Connecticut was barely gaining population and Rhode Island was barely losing population, but now it's the exact opposite. The only place that I stopped at in Rhode Island was the capital, Providence. I didn't go into Providence with the highest expectations, but I did come out pleasantly surprised. The downtown was well set up for walking around, some nice parks. The state capitol building is right there, and there's a good hill right next to that where it goes up to some really beautiful historic homes. And this neighborhood was really cool to walk around these tree-lined streets with these old homes. It's probably the most expensive part of town I would expect. And just the town itself was much hillier than I thought it would be, and just more of a workout walking than I expected. The main restaurant and nightlife and entertainment district is called Federal Hill, and this is a really cool spot with some great shops and restaurants. It's also home to Brown University, which is another Ivy League school, and when you go to the part of the town where the campus is, it does have kind of that Ivy League feel to it. So overall, I would say Providence is not that bad at all, so I do want to apologize to Providence and the state of Rhode Island because I have a video titled The 10 Worst State Capitals, and at number 10 was Providence. I was basing that off of statistics from about 10 years ago when the city was really struggling. During the 2008 to 2010 financial crisis, Rhode Island was hurt more than most other states. It was kind of a joke for a bit because they couldn't afford to keep the lights on their main skyscraper in town. The state was losing population and everything was getting worse. But there have obviously been some major improvements in recent years, and it really isn't that bad of a city. I'm not going to put it on my top 10 state capitals list, but it really isn't that bad. And so this is a perfect example of why I don't talk too much about places in which I have not been, because in this case I was wrong. But just like Connecticut, I wasn't able to see the entire state, and I really wanted to go to the south part of the state along the coast, the historic town of Newport, Block Island, but I just wasn't able to fit it into my schedule. Next up, I entered Massachusetts. Driving from Providence to Boston is basically just going through suburbs the entire time. And I was like a giddy little kid driving into Boston because it had been the only big city in the country I had not been to. I spent a day and a half in the city, and I have to say, I love it. Boston easily, for me, slides into the number 3 spot in terms of the best cities for walking in the country. It's not going to pass San Francisco or Manhattan, but it is a great city for walking around. I walked almost 12 miles one day just kind of walking around the city. I walked around basically the entire peninsula. I parked my car near the John Adams Courthouse right in the heart of downtown and just spent the entire day walking around. I walked through Boston Common, down to Back Bay, up the Charles River shoreline area. Went up to the West End, the area around where the Boston Bruins play, the North End. And then I walked around the northeastern portion of the peninsula, which is the oldest part of the city. This is where you have some of the colonial era buildings, the Paul Revere House, Faneuil Hall. So I had a really good time putting all these miles under my feet, and the best part about it was that I was totally lost. I have a really good sense of direction. It's really hard for me to get lost in most cities, but man, I had no idea where I was going in Boston. It easily has the most complicated and convoluted street network in the country. There are all kinds of crazy intersections, weird stoplights. I know I ran at least one stoplight that I knew of, and probably more than one because I couldn't even tell I was running it. I'd be walking around and had no idea where I was going, taking this street, that street. Then after a couple hours, look at my phone and I'm like, wow, I had no idea this is where I was. And it was really cloudy that day and I couldn't really see the sun for direction. So yes, Boston is my kryptonite when it comes to sense of direction. But a lot of really great neighborhoods there. Back Bay is probably the most upscale part of town, some of the upscale shops. Boston Common is just this big giant green space in the middle of the city. Really cool to have that. And then I saw the state capitol building with this giant screen in front of it. The second day I was in Boston was more about driving around and seeing some of the other areas that weren't right on the peninsula. And I keep saying peninsula, but I don't think the people there refer to it as the peninsula, but I did. I went to Cambridge, which is a suburb directly adjacent to Boston, very historic. This is where Harvard University is, another Ivy League school, and a lot of major high-rises there as well. So the downtown skyline of Cambridge is almost as impressive as Boston, surprisingly. The next place I stopped was Newburyport, which is in the northeastern portion of the state near the New Hampshire border. And just like everything else in coastal New England, it's old, it's historic, and it looks really cool. It had a nice main street for walking around. It's very touristy. I got the impression that basically everybody there was from the Boston metro area. In most of the other major New England tourist areas, you have a lot of New York accents, New Jersey accents to go along with the New England ones, but in Newburyport is basically just New England people, it seemed like. And then on my way back through the road trip, I drove through the Berkshires. This is the mountainous area in the western ends of the state, very beautiful. I didn't walk or do any hiking in this area, I just drove through very beautiful scenery, and I just drove through the city of Springfield, didn't stop there. And you might not know this about western Massachusetts, but in the sleepy west of the woody east is a valley full of pioneers. It's educational. The next state that I visited was New Hampshire, and the first part I visited of the state is the coastal area. I took Highway 1A up the coast, and it goes right to the town of Hampton first, and after that to the beach town of Rye Beach. Both Rye and Hampton are both very nice towns, fairly upscale. So really nice beaches and probably the best sandy beaches that I saw in the region. The next city I stopped in was Portsmouth, which is the northernmost portion of the New Hampshire coast, right along the Maine border. And no surprise with a New England coastal town, very historic, nice downtown, really quaint for walking around. A nice waterfront area and just overall a nice town. Just inland from the coastal towns is the town of Exeter, another really old historic town. Another quaint main street good for walking around is some old historic buildings. I next visited the city of Manchester, which is the largest city in the state. And even though it's not that big, it still is the biggest city in New Hampshire, so it does have that kind of biggest city in the state feel. It's where the biggest banks and insurance companies are and just some of the business of the state. I like the downtown. There's some nice shops, good local boutiques and restaurants. And just like any other city of its size, there's going to be a part of town that's much poorer, a little rough, and got a little bit higher crime. However, for Manchester, it really isn't that bad, so the worse that New Hampshire gets, really isn't that bad. Well, except for a part of the state that I'll mention in a minute. My next stop was Concord, which is the state capital, and this was probably the most pleasant surprise for me on the trip. I wasn't expecting much out of it, but ended up liking it. I enjoyed walking around the downtown, some nice shops there, and I went to a bunch of record shops on this road trip, and my favorite one during the entire trip was Pitchfork Records in Concord. Great record shop, not afraid to give them a plug. And while I'm at it, I'll give another one a plug. I was driving down New Hampshire Highway 16 in the eastern portion of the state, went through a town called Conway, and it's a really small town, but I'm sitting there in bumper to bumper traffic waiting for a stoplight for a few minutes, and off to the side of the road is a sign that says, Revolution Records, come on in, we're awesome. I was like, all right, sounds good, turned in there, and it is a good store. And this portion of the state is just very, very pretty. You can see the high mountains of the White Mountain National Forest, including Mount Washington, the highest peak in the state. I also drove the Kankamangas Highway, I think that's how it's pronounced. It goes east-west through some of the mountainous portions of the northern part of the state. However, I have to say I was a little bit disappointed with this. I was expecting a really slow 25, 30 mile an hour drive where you're pulling over all the time to take pictures, stuck behind a slow truck, but you don't really care because the scenery is so beautiful. But that's not how it is at all. It's just a regular old 55 mile an hour state highway through a beautiful part of the state. Now, there are plenty of spots you can pull over. There's trailheads and hiking, good campgrounds and stuff, but the overall drive itself wasn't quite what I expected. And when you get to the northernmost portion of the state, that's where it starts to get a little bit different. This is one of those areas that's been besieged by the opioid crisis. There's a town called Berlin in the far north, and it's rough. And there are quite a few cities like this in the region and throughout the country, unfortunately, but it's a situation where so many folks in that town have just become addicted to drugs. And so I'll show a map here of the opioid crisis. Most people talk about southwestern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky for good reason. Look at this map, but look at northern New Hampshire. You don't hear about the struggles of northern New Hampshire as much as Appalachia, but it is pretty bad up there. But at least the scenery is beautiful. And the last state that I visited in New England was Vermont. And once I crossed the state line in Vermont, it became official. I've been to every state in the U.S. except for Alaska and Hawaii. My first stop in the state was the state capital of Montpelier. And this is just the cutest little state capital in the country. Small little town, cute little state capitol building, cute little main street. And that's just the word for Vermont. It's cute. I mean, you can't look at this building and not be like, aww. So Montpelier is another one that bucks the trend of not very nice small town state capitals. This is the smallest town state capital, although technically the quote-unquote metro area is larger than Pierre, South Dakota, but this is a pretty small state capital. The next place I visited was Burlington, which is the largest city in the state, even though it really isn't that big. It sits there right along the coast of Lake Champlain, which is the border with New York. Gorgeous area. And just like most of the rest of the region, really great for walking, nice downtown, very compact. You can go straight from the shops and restaurants of downtown to the waterfront area along the lake. Lots of folks sitting out there having picnics. There's a little food truck there selling ice cream, or they call them creamies. Got me a maple creamy. And another really good record shop here, Burlington Records. Although I do have to say, Burlington wasn't quite as weird as I was expecting. A nice town, kind of quirky, kind of funky, but really not all that weird. Not too far from there is Camel's Hump State Park, which is one of the highest peaks in the state. And this is just a wonderful hike through some beautiful woods. And this is a really popular hiking spot. I got there about 8 in the morning, and there were about 5 cars already in the parking lot. It's a pretty small lot. When I got done, the entire lot was completely full, and people were parked about a half a mile away. So if you're going to do it, get there early. And then I drove down Highway 7 from Burlington all the way down to the Massachusetts border. And shocking surprise, this is a beautiful drive. It goes right by Green Mountain National Forest, goes by the White Rocks Natural Area. It's just a beautiful drive through a short amount of time. And along Highway 7 is the last town that I stopped in, and that's Rutland. And I guess you could say that Rutland is the roughest town in Vermont, if you can even really use that term. It's a little rough around the edges, but nothing as much as similar-sized cities in the south. One of the things about Vermont that I really liked was just the sheer number of farm stands. So many folks just selling fruits and vegetables and chicken eggs from their house. And you see this in all parts of the country, but man, it was really common in Vermont. So Vermont, beautiful state, great state to drive through. I had a great time visiting. Now I want to discuss some of the foods that we ate while we were there, and we had seafood basically every day. Had clam chowder several times. I love the different varieties of clam chowder you get in the region. Had some really good fresh fish straight from the boats. Had some really good poutine, which is a Quebec dish. And you're pretty close to the Quebec border when you're in northern New England, so had some good Quebec influence there. Also had some really good lobster, but I have to say, I do love lobster, but I don't like lobster rolls that much. It's essentially lobster meat coated in mayonnaise and coleslaw on a toasted bun, which to me ruins the lobster. I'd rather just have the lobster on the toasted bun. But one thing I did like was this stuff here. It's called Moxie. It's a soda. It's distinctively different, which is like being repetitively redundant, but I mean, it's a guilty pleasure. It tastes kind of like RC Cola mixed with root beer, which sounds kind of weird, but that was pretty good. One thing about New Englanders, they love their ice cream and will wait in line for a long time to get it. We were in a town called Bar Harbor, which is adjacent to Acadia National Park, very touristy, but also very small. There were like 4 ice cream parlors in town, and every single one of them had a long line going out the door. We're talking 4 ice cream parlors like on a 2-block stretch. So people there really love their ice cream, and we thought maybe it's because it's only warm for a few months of the year, until maybe they're just catching up on all those cold months to get some ice cream. But this guy was talking to us, and he's like, no, we eat ice cream all the time. It can be freezing. We'll be standing outside in line to get ice cream then, too. So, yeah, New Englanders love their ice cream. I also want to briefly discuss the accents that we heard there, because I really like these New England accents, and I found it interesting that the spatial variation of these accents, where New England is a small area, but there's a wide range of the accents you'll hear. And the cliche one you'll think of is the R sound, pronounced ah. And so when you go to some of these places, you want to hear people say the really cliche things in that accent. And we were in a town called Bar Harbor, and we literally heard someone say this exact phrase: "It's hard to park the car in Bar Harbor." I mean, that's a terrible attempt at that accent, but I mean, it is hard to park the car in Bar Harbor. But that's exactly the line you want to hear somebody say when you go to New England. And the last thing I want to discuss is just the friendliness of the people there. And whenever I go somewhere, I try to engage people in conversation to see just what the local mindset is and see what people think about the place where they live. And I've never had an easier time getting people to engage in long conversation than in New England. I mean, it wasn't just 1 or 2 people. It was the majority of people I spoke to. And it wasn't just in the small towns either. It was also in Boston. So it seems like everywhere I went, people were willing to talk to me. And it was just really cool, because you'd always heard, or at least I'd always heard, that people in the Northeast are the unfriendliest people in the country. They're rude and they're just mean and just not very friendly. But I found it to be the exact opposite. And people were just really willing to open up and talk. I mean, I'm not sure if it's because I have a half California, half Southern accent, and people could tell I wasn't from anywhere near there. And, it smells like half hippie, half redneck. And well, your nose didn't deceive you. But it just was really cool to hear people just really want to talk about their places, because I hadn't been there, so I wanted to know a lot about some of these intricacies of the culture there and stuff. So just really good time just talking to people, and I really just had a good time the entire time on this trip. We thoroughly enjoyed basically every aspect of this road trip, although congestion on some of the back roads in the small towns can be a little frustrating. But other than that, it was a wonderful trip, and I can't wait to get back there next year. So if you're from New England and you're a little disappointed that I didn't see the best spots in the region, just know that this is a scouting trip, essentially. We're planning a much larger New England road trip next year, but now we kind of know what we want to see again, what's okay to skip, and what places we skip that we really do want to see this next time. So I'm really looking forward to this big trip next year, because this one really got me excited for the next one. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about U.S. geography. I'm talking about cities and states and counties, comparing them and ranking things in all kinds of different categories, talking about cross-country road tripping, and pretty much everything I talk about comes from a little more nerdy type perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out.